What's the most disturbing thing that has ever happened to you or someone you know? Story 1. This one is not very exciting, just strange. My grandmother was always irrationally afraid of dogs. She liked them, but they made her nervous because they were too messy, loud, and unpredictable. She would always tell us not to leave the door open on nice days, saying, "Close that door. A big black dog might walk in." She had this fear that one day she would turn around and there would be a big black Labrador slobbering on her floors. We always laughed at her oddly specific fear. We knew everyone who lived nearby and their dogs. The biggest and blackest dog within 1 mile of her house was a Yorkshire Terrier, so her fear seemed unfounded. Years later, my grandmother passed away. My father and I had the sad task of clearing out her house. Things were a bit stuffy, so we left the door open to the yard and got to work. After a while, we both heard a strange noise and looked up. It sounded like panting. We turned around, and there was a big black Labrador sitting in the middle of the kitchen, just gazing up at us happily, drooling on my grandmother's linoleum, exactly as she had always said would happen. We completely lost it, laughing uncontrollably and even crying a little. We gave the dog some pets and escorted him back outside. My father shut the door, looked upward, and said, "Sorry, Mom, you were right." Story 2. I developed schizophrenia and had my first schizophrenic attack at work. It started as a normal day, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see things shifting and distorting. Usually I saw bugs, but that had become normal at that point, since I had already been diagnosed with psychosis. This time, though, it was different. Out of nowhere, I looked up and saw a hooded person burst through the doors with a gun. I screamed and dropped to the floor, and everyone stared at me like I was completely out of my mind. I was so panicked that I did not care. I could still see the person, and apparently I was rambling. People started asking me what I had taken and what I was on. I came back to reality a bit and told them I thought I had been drugged. I do not remember much after that. I just kept getting this horrible, sinking, hopeless feeling of dread in the back of my mind. Like an atomic bomb was dropping right next to me, and there was nothing I could do. I still have days like that. That was 6 years ago. Story 3. This happened to my mother when she was 14. She and her stepfather were watching television one day when suddenly they heard the family dog going wild, barking nonstop. My mother looked outside and saw no one, so she dismissed it as the dog just being a dog. About an hour later, she headed upstairs to go to bed. When she reached the top floor, she noticed that the light in her room was on. Growing up with prankster brothers, she assumed they were in her room causing trouble. She opened the door, ready to tell them to get out, but was met with a horrifying sight. Everything in her room was overturned, and on her bed sat a disheveled woman wearing my mother's clothes. The woman turned around, looked at my mother, and said, "I am going to kill you," before lunging at her with a pair of clothing scissors. My mother ran out of the room in terror. Her stepfather did not believe her at first, but when he checked, he immediately called the police. It turned out the woman had escaped from a local asylum and had sneaked past my mother and her stepfather earlier, which was what the dog had been barking at. Story 4. In college, I took a local history course. Part of the course required us to dig into the local museum archives and read journals, notes, and other records that had been collected over the years, then write an essay on a chosen subject. Once I had narrowed down my topic, I spent several nights going through century-old field journals of a local surveyor. Most of the entries were dull, filled with notes about local geography, survey coordinates, and other mundane details. While delicately going through what was probably the 15th book, wearing the special archive gloves we were required to use, I turned a page and found something that froze me. Written in pencil, right in the middle of the page, in the surveyor's handwriting, was my name first and last spelled exactly the same. Nothing else was written around it, just my name, casually jotted down as if it were a contact. It really creeped me out since the notebooks were nearly 100 years old, and as far as I knew, no one had opened them since they were donated to the museum. My name is not extremely rare, but seeing it written exactly the same way by someone from so long ago felt deeply unsettling. Story 5. When I was in elementary school, I went ridiculously early for swim practice. It turned out it was canceled, and I only found out when I got there. That meant I had the whole school to myself. I waited near the school gate, and soon enough my homeroom teacher arrived. I greeted her saying, "Hi, Ms. Grace." Here is where it gets strange. She ignored me and walked past me. Confused, I looked toward the gate, then back at where she had been walking, except she was gone. I was a bit frightened at that point, so I went to wait outside my locked classroom, which happened to be next to the restrooms. I sat on the floor for a while. A few minutes later, I heard the eeriest, creepiest laugh coming from the restroom. It was high-pitched and witch-like, making the hairs on my neck stand up. I was so scared that I ran back toward the school gate. A few minutes later, my homeroom teacher, the one I had just seen earlier, who ignored me and then vanished, walked through the gate. She saw me and greeted me. I was too freaked out to reply. To this day, I have no idea what really happened. It remains the only paranormal experience I have never been able to explain. Story 6. My friend and I were coming back from a concert in Manchester. It was about midnight, and I was driving. We were going down the motorway on a stretch that carried on for well over 100 miles, so we had no reason to turn off at any junctions. A few minutes later, we realized we were on a dual carriageway that was getting smaller and smaller until we were suddenly on a tiny single-lane road surrounded by 10-foot-high bushes. It was definitely not a motorway anymore. Neither of us knew how that happened. We both could not remember leaving the motorway, and we had no idea how we managed to go from 4 lanes to 2 lanes to 1 lane without realizing it. We still drive the same motorway to go to concerts and have never had that issue again, but we always laugh about it on the way home. Story 7. I was plagued by terrible sleep paralysis for most of my childhood. I would fall asleep normally and wake up with my face in the pillow, unable to move my body as I suffocated. I still do not know how I survived those moments. Other times I would hear loud whispering from multiple voices that I could not understand coming from outside my doorway, or hear static and doors opening and closing, standard sleep paralysis hallucinations. It rarely happens anymore because I have changed the way I fall asleep. Now it only happens when I am so exhausted that I cannot fall into a proper sleep and end up in that limbo between awake and asleep. Late last summer, I had just returned from visiting family in England and was exhausted from traveling. I fell asleep watching something on my tablet and had a dream I barely remember, except that I was in a house where the doors in the hallway started opening and closing, as if someone was searching for me. In the dream, I pretended to be asleep when the door to my room opened. I then woke up, or rather, I thought I did. Anyone who has experienced sleep paralysis knows that moment when you are conscious but cannot move, aware of your surroundings while your body feels like a heavy, lifeless weight. I felt an immense pressure, like someone much heavier than me was pressing down on my back, leaning close to whisper in my ear. I tried to move but couldn't. Then I heard a deep, sinister voice say loudly, "No one will save you." I jolted up, gasping like people do in movies. If it hadn't been 3 o'clock in the morning, I probably would have gone to my mother's bed despite being 20 years old. Instead, I tried not to cry and turned on the lights. I stayed awake until sunrise just in case it happened again. I do not scare easily, but that night still shakes me to this day because of how real it felt. Story 8. My mother's whole side of the family was raised Catholic, and they all went to the same church in a small southern town. I was there one summer as a 10-year-old with my mother. My uncle's farmland backed right up to the church. Things had not been going well. On the farm, crops were failing, healthy animals were suddenly dying, and chickens and small creatures were showing up gutted even though he had a donkey to protect the livestock. It was strange, unnatural. One day the adults were acting nervous, clearly hiding something serious. My grandmother, mother, uncle, aunt, some older cousins, the priest, and another man from the church were all at my uncle's farm. They told me to go play outside. Naturally, being a curious kid, I climbed the tallest tree near the house to eavesdrop. I could only catch bits of their conversation, but soon everyone followed the priest around the barn, stables, and chicken coop. From my perch in the tree, I kept watching. While they were down by the stables, I heard the house door open. A woman I had never seen before, around 30 years old, brown hair, wearing a blue dress, walked out. She looked up at me briefly. I waved. She ignored me and walked down the dirt road. Later, the adults gathered inside for lemonade. I asked who the woman in the blue dress was, since I had never seen her before. Every adult froze. My aunt started crying, the priest turned pale, and they told me she was just visiting. I did not question it then. A decade later, my uncle finally told me that the woman I saw was an apparition that had been appearing to parishioners and around his land. They first thought she was a lost soul, but after she attacked the priest at his house and animals began turning up dead, they realized she was something darker, a demon appearing as a woman. The day I saw her, the adults had received permission from the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism on the land. Apparently, I had witnessed her leaving. I sometimes wonder where she went. I am 26 years old now, and the story of Evelyn, as they called her, still gives me goosebumps. She looked completely expressionless when she glanced at me, as if she had no reason to hurry. After she vanished, the crops began to recover, and the animals stopped dying. I am not religious and generally a skeptic, but I will never be able to explain what I saw from that oak tree. Story 9. There was one time I went camping with two of my friends, though neither of them were really the outdoorsy type. I was just trying to get them into the whole camping and hunting scene. I love hiking more, like exploring, because I hate just walking on a trail. You see nothing new, so I took my friends out a few miles, and after about 2 miles from camp, they wanted to go back. I said fine and showed them where to go on my phone, making them set a waypoint on the GPS device I had so they could follow it. I wanted to keep going, so I did by myself. They wanted the pistol I had for safety reasons, leaving me to walk alone in the forest with just water and nothing else. No big deal, I thought. When I was about 5 miles from camp, I found a steep hillside covered with rocks and decided to climb down. I followed what used to be a riverbed, dry and narrow, heading farther south. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt, like something was wrong. There was a huge log across the path, and as I crouched to crawl under it, I suddenly felt watched. I looked up to my left, nothing. I looked around the riverbed, then up to my right, and froze. A massive black canine stood there. It was too small to be a bear, but looked like a wolf on steroids. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, though it could not have been more than 10 seconds. The longer I stared, the worse the feeling of dread became. I stepped back to leave, and the creature bolted into the forest, away from camp. The walk back was haunting. I did not feel watched anymore, but I could not shake the feeling that it would catch up to me eventually. That is why I never hike alone anymore. Story 10. When I was a young boy, I fell out of a tree, hitting several branches on the way down before hitting the ground hard. I was alone and was not found for about 10 or 15 minutes. I was heavily concussed, but I clearly remember seeing an elderly man in a dark suit and hat standing over me while I lay there. He just stared at me with piercing eyes and offered no help. He scared me more than the fall did. Some teenagers found me, and when I regained consciousness, the man was gone. I asked if they had seen him, but they said no one was there. They helped me up and walked me home, but I could not stop asking about the man or looking around for him. Years later, I learned about the hatman, and I am now convinced I was close to death that day, and that he was there to take me to the other side, kind of like the Grim Reaper. Story 11. I grew up in a military family, and we moved around a lot. When I was about 3, we moved to a military base in Cherry Point, North Carolina. Every single night for the year and a half we lived there, I would run to my parents' room screaming that there was a lady in my closet staring at me. Whenever my parents came in to check, she was gone. Eventually, they started locking their door because it happened every night and they got tired of it. Fast forward 18 years, and I was sitting with my mom looking up all the places we had lived for nostalgia's sake. It turns out there is a legend on that base about a ghost of a woman. When they built the base, her grave was separated from her children's, and it is said that she roams the bedrooms of children on the base looking for her own. I had a panic attack when I read that. The ghost's name is Kissy Sykes, if anyone is curious. Story 12. My parents moved into a house not too long ago that desperately needed updating. It looked straight out of the 1970s. They hired builders to renovate it, but some strange things started happening that made everyone uneasy and almost caused the workers to quit. At first, there were random knocks and bangs that could easily be explained away, but one day there was a loud crash, like a wall had collapsed. My parents ran to check, but nothing was out of place. Later, when my parents were out, the workers claimed they heard a huge bang from the bathroom. When they went to investigate, the radiator had been ripped off the wall and a couple of wooden cabinet units had been stacked on top of it. What made it worse was that they found 2 footprints in the dust from the Renovation bare feet, both left feet side by side. When my parents got home, the workers were shaken, saying they wanted to leave without finishing. As they spoke, everyone could hear faint singing somewhere in the house, soft and wordless. They eventually convinced the workers to stay, but whatever happened must have been serious for them to threaten walking out on a big job like that. Story 13. I have a half-brother who is much younger than me. When he was about 2 or 3 years old, I was in a hot tub with him and his parents, and he kept wanting to go underwater. We were trying to explain why he couldn't do that. At some point, my stepmother said something like, "If something bad happened to you, Mommy and Daddy would be very sad and miss you very much." My brother looked at her and said, "Would I go up to heaven again, Mommy?" Probably explainable, but still very creepy. I also have a friend with an odd phobia of things that swing. She will not sit on a rocking chair or a porch swing, cannot stand grandfather clocks, and gets uneasy around wind chimes. One day we were out with her mother and the topic came up. My friend explained that her fear came from a vivid memory as a small child, sitting in a car seat in the back while her mother drove. She remembered watching something hanging from the rear view mirror swinging back and forth, and then they were in a terrible car accident. That was all she remembered. Her mother looked shocked and said that never happened. They had never been in a car accident. Story 14. Years ago, before I met my wife and had my daughter, I had 3 dreams in one night where I had a daughter. In the first dream, she was a newborn. In the second, a toddler. In the last, an adult. All 3 felt incredibly real, and I woke up from each one filled with a huge wave of love and emotion. I spent the next day feeling like I missed her, even though she did not exist. I eventually forgot about it until years later when my daughter was born. The memories of those dreams came rushing back, and it was the same feeling I had experienced that night. She is 5 years old now, and I still feel that same connection. It could easily be a coincidence, but I cannot shake the sense that I somehow saw my future that night. The biggest reason I believe that is because my daughter has blonde hair and blue eyes, something that stood out in my dream since no one in either my family or my wife's family has blonde hair. I am a redhead and she is a brunette. Maybe it is just coincidence, but it felt real then and still does now. Story 15. I completely believe my old townhouse was haunted. I first noticed strange things when I was in the living room and heard someone running across the upstairs floor, stomping loudly. I panicked and checked, but there was no one there. Later, whenever I was in my bedroom with the door open, I saw odd shadows moving in the hallway that shouldn't have been there. Things escalated when I was lying in bed one night with my head against the wall and heard knocking from the other side. The problem was that my bedroom was on the 2nd floor. There was no way anyone could be knocking from outside. Immediately after that, I went to take a shower, and when I took off my shirt, there were long scratches across my chest. I was terrified. My brother and I were tormented by whatever this was for months. We ended up sleeping in the same room because neither of us could stand being alone at night. The last time I encountered it was unforgettable. I was upstairs playing video games when I heard a girl crying loudly like she was in the house. I was home alone, so I knew it had to be the ghost. I followed the sound downstairs to the kitchen, and as soon as I entered, the crying stopped. I turned around, and it was standing right there. It was about 5.5 feet tall, shaped like a person, but completely black, darker than anything I have ever seen. It looked like someone had cut a hole in reality, a void shaped like a human. That was the strangest and most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Story 16. The strangest and most inexplicable thing that has ever happened to me occurred only a few months ago. I was briefly working at a college bookstore, and one of my tasks was to call customers who had ordered books that were out of stock and let them know their books had arrived. I had already called a large number of people that day and was in the rhythm of it. The process was simple. If someone answered, I followed one script. If I got an answering machine, I followed another. Easy enough until I called one number and got neither. Just silence. It threw me off a bit, and after a few seconds, I hung up. I called again, and this time, it sounded like someone picked up and was quietly listening. For some reason, I didn't say anything and just listened too. I could faintly hear background noises, people talking softly. Then I heard a quiet, "Hey, how can I help you today?" And a man replied, "I need to pick up my book." I froze. A second later, my coworker standing behind me at the desk said, "Hey, how can I help you today?" To a man who had just walked in and said, "I need to pick up my book." I got goosebumps. I listened for a few seconds more, and what I heard on the line matched their conversation, but about a second before it happened in real life. I hung up, stepped away from the desk, and told my coworkers, "I'm going on my break." I spent that break sitting outside in silence, trying to understand what had just happened. I didn't make any more calls that day and never told anyone at work. Story 17. When I was about 5 years old, I was playing in my room, which had thick blue carpet wall to wall. I was sitting near my closet, playing with stuffed animals, when I heard low growling and barking. I looked around and saw what looked like dog teeth coming up through the carpet fibers. Just the teeth, nothing else. And they were opening and closing with the sounds of vicious snarling. It's hard to describe, but it was unmistakable. I froze in terror for a moment before running out of my room and screaming for my mom. When I finally dragged her back to see, there was nothing there. It never happened again, but it remains one of my earliest and clearest memories. I'm 30 now, so this was a long time ago, and it's possible my memory has exaggerated or altered what happened. I even asked my mom about it a few years ago. She remembers me running out of my room in a panic and trying to explain what I saw. I figure she remembers my reaction, so it wasn't just a dream. I still think about it sometimes, and I still can't explain it. Story 18. On April 12, 1992, Easter Sunday, in rural West Virginia, I was 7 years old. We were at my grandmother's house after finishing the Easter egg hunt, standing around in her backyard. The sun was low, maybe 2 hours from setting. Her house sat against a hill covered in overgrown forsythia bushes. The branches had grown long and bent over until they nearly touched their roots, creating a kind of forsythia cave. You could see inside, but you couldn't get in. The adults were counting eggs. My cousins were pretending to be Evel Knievel and jumping off the cellar roof. And I was standing a few feet from the forsythia cave when I suddenly went into a trance. I stared at the bushes and something appeared. It was opaque and grayish-white, swirling inside the forsythia cave. I wanted someone else to see it and explain it to me. I was sure my cousin was standing right behind me. I could feel his body heat in the presence of another person, almost touching my shoulders. I turned to say, "Lee, look at that." And when I turned back, everything changed. The warmth and the presence vanished, and there was no one within 20 feet of me. The swirling shape was gone too. I felt strange after that, hollow somehow. I told my mom, and she believes the person I felt behind me was her father, who died when she was a little girl about my age. She and I looked nearly identical. I'm not sure what it was. I don't really believe in the supernatural, but something about that day still haunts me. Her family didn't move there until the late 1950s, and they once found Catholic relics buried in the yard, something rare for rural West Virginia. Story 19. When I lived in the United States, I went hiking in the woods near the small house I was renting. The trails were well kept and surrounded by thick forest. At the time, I was working on my doctoral thesis and feeling depressed after a bad panic attack, so I decided a walk would help. The air smelled like wet grass after a rain, the sun was shining, and I could hear birds and crickets. It was peaceful. The main trail branched off into smaller ones, and I always took the same path since I knew it well and couldn't get lost. As I approached a fork in the smaller trail, I saw a man standing right in the middle of it, his back turned to me. He didn't move or turn around, just swayed slowly from side to side. He wore a brown jacket and hat. I kept walking, thinking he would hear me and turn, but he didn't. I stopped and watched, realizing his arms were stiff at his sides. Something about it felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I turned and ran. When I looked back, he hadn't moved. A few days later, I went back to the same spot and the woods were empty. Maybe I could have called out to him, but I was a petite woman in my 20s, and the whole thing just felt off. I still get chills thinking about it. Story 20. This happened to my friend, and honestly, I would have lost it if it were me. She was a kid, I don't remember how old, but she was outside her late grandfather's mansion playing with a red remote-controlled car. The backyard was maybe 5 to 7 meters long and led straight into the woods. While she was playing, she looked up and saw a figure standing among the trees. She said it had no distinguishable features, just a dark, human-shaped silhouette, like a shadow. She set down her toy, stood up, and tried to open the back door without taking her eyes off the thing. The door wouldn't open. She tried again and again, jiggling the handle, but it was stuck. When she finally turned around to face the door, she heard movement, and when she looked back, the figure was sprinting toward her, but not like a person. It was running on all fours. She screamed and leapt over a fence as tall as she was, pure adrenaline. She ran into her grandfather's garage and hid there, suddenly feeling safe as if whatever that thing was couldn't get to her there. Strangely, her grandmother had died of a heart attack in that same garage years earlier. She hid under her dad's truck until her parents got back. They couldn't get her out, and she even bit her dad while trying to stay under the truck, terrified to move. She ended up sleeping there that night. When she told her mom about it years later, her mom said that when they went to the backyard, her red remote-controlled car was smashed, like something huge had stepped on it. Story 21. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I used to sleep beside my grandparents every summer when my brothers and I stayed at their house. One warm night, we didn't use blankets, except for my oldest brother. I was dreaming, though I can't remember what, when I suddenly woke up because someone was pulling me down from the bed with ice-cold hands. I was sleeping between my grandparents, and my brothers were on the other side of the room by the wall. At first, I thought they were playing a prank, but it was pitch dark, and I was being dragged farther down, my legs already hanging off the bed. I started screaming, which woke everyone up. My grandmother turned on the light and asked what was wrong. I told her someone had been pulling me down, and their hands were freezing, especially strange on a hot summer night. She scolded me for waking everyone, but my grandfather comforted me. My brothers gave me one of their blankets, and my grandfather decided to sleep sideways in case it happened again. It did happen more than once, and from then on, I always used a blanket, no matter how hot it was. Only my eldest brother believed me because he said the same thing had happened to him once, which was why he always slept covered, even in the middle of summer. Story 22. When I was in high school, my bedroom was downstairs, and no one had ever lived in our house before us. Sometimes I would smell something strange in my room, like burning wood or a fireplace. But we didn't have one, and neither did any of our neighbors. The smell wasn't unpleasant, just unsettling because it had no clear source. Every time it appeared, the room would grow colder than the rest of the house, especially over my bed. I could hold my hand above it and feel the temperature difference. I even moved my bed once, and the cold spot moved with it. Over time, I began feeling as if someone was in the room with me. At first, it wasn't threatening, just eerie, but later I began sensing something darker, like there were two presences, one neutral and one malevolent. That's when I started having sleep paralysis. I would wake up unable to breathe, as though something was pressing on my chest. Whenever that happened, the smell of burning wood would become much stronger, and after a few minutes, the menacing feeling would fade. It got worse over time until I started sleeping on the couch. One night, it even happened there. I woke up paralyzed, gasping for air, and finally screamed, "Go away!" After that, I never experienced the paralysis or the evil presence again. The wood-burning smell and cold air would still return occasionally, but less often. Later, I learned our neighborhood had once been a plantation. Near the road leading into it, there was an old slave cemetery in the woods, you could tell, because most of the headstones had no last names and many had unknown birth dates. People used to dump trash near it, and I sometimes went to clean it up. My mother believes that maybe, just maybe, something followed me home one day. Story 23. This isn't a disturbing story, just something unexplainable that has stuck with me. Back in high school, I was sort of homeless. It's complicated. Every morning, I would walk to a gym to shower and work out before heading to school. Sometimes my friends would come too, and on those days I'd get a ride with them instead of walking the 4 miles to school. We'd usually stop at Dunkin' Donuts for coffee and a donut before class. I didn't have money most of the time, so I would just hang out and chat with them for a bit. What my friends didn't realize was that I was usually exhausted and hungry. Between walking long distances, little sleep, and barely eating, I was drained, but I hid it well. No one at school besides my close friends knew my situation. One morning while we were sitting there, a woman walked up to me, handed me a coffee and a donut, and said something like, "Something tells me you need this." I don't remember her exact words. It's been over 10 years, but I remember being stunned. I wasn't dirty or dazed or giving off any obvious sign of struggle. Yet somehow she knew. It was one of the kindest things a stranger has ever done for me, and I'll never forget it. Story 24. This isn't horrifying or disturbing, but it's something I still can't explain. About a month ago, on my way to work, I was driving behind a beat-up Peugeot 206 covered in stickers. One in particular stood out. It said, "Too close for comfort." I thought it was odd, but didn't think much of it. The road I take to work has a large turnoff that leads only to the motorway. The Peugeot turned down that road and I kept going straight. A few seconds later, I rounded a corner, and there it was again. The same Peugeot, right in front of me. There was no possible way it could have turned around and overtaken me. The only route from that turnoff led directly onto the motorway. The only explanation I can think of is that it somehow cut through the fields and hedges back onto the road. But I didn't notice anything unusual or out of place. Story 25. There was a house my boyfriend and our friends used to go ghost hunting in, long before all those ghost hunting shows became popular. The house had been abandoned for years, and the local story was that the man who lived there went insane and killed his wife, children, and possibly his brother with an axe. There were holes in the upstairs walls where it looked like someone had hacked through them. We had gone there many times before, and though weird things would happen, flashlights and cameras not working, it was never anything extreme. One night we went with a bigger group than usual, about 10 of us. We split into pairs, 2 in the attic, 2 on the second floor, 2 on the ground floor, 2 in the basement, and 2 in the old barn outside. My boyfriend and I took the second floor. I knew that house inside and out from our many visits. I had explored every inch of it. But as we walked around that night, I suddenly found a room I had never seen before. It was a huge bathroom with a clawfoot tub connecting 2 bedrooms. I froze. That room had never been there before. I loved antique tubs, and I would have remembered something like that. My boyfriend swore it had always been there, but I knew he was wrong. He made me stay in that new bathroom for our entire 20 minutes, and I was terrified it would vanish and take me with it. It didn't, and we eventually regrouped outside. Just as we did, someone started shooting near the barn, and we all ran for the van and sped off. Later, I went back with friends who had also been there before, and the bathroom was gone, completely gone. It's been 15 years, and to this day, that's the most unexplainable thing I've ever experienced. Story 26. My brother was killed in a work-related accident at a factory. He worked the midnight shift at a place that was cutting corners on safety, and he lost his life just 10 minutes before the end of his shift while trying to clear an obstruction from a press. He was the backbone of our broken family, my parents' only son, and my best friend. He had a heart of gold and would literally give you the shoes off his feet. I saw him do it once at a mall. When 2 officers showed up at our door instead of him coming home, it shattered us. About 2 hours later, as we were all sitting downstairs grieving and wishing for one more moment with him, there was an enormous crash upstairs. My brother had been 6'7", around 300 pounds, and loved to skateboard. The sound was exactly like one of his heavy landings, or like a large piece of furniture falling over. We ran upstairs but found nothing out of place. No explanation for the noise. Sometime later, I found a Coke bottle with his name on it. I bought it, brought it home, and when I picked it out of the cooler, it was dark like a normal Coke. But about an hour later, when I handed it to my mom, it had turned a pale brown. I took a tiny sip. It was flat, tasteless, and colorless. We keep it next to his urn to this day. There have been many moments since when we felt his presence, but one stands out. My boyfriend, who never met him, once jumped as we were parking near my car and said, Whoa! I swear there was a big guy sitting in your back seat. I looked and saw nothing, just smiled and said, "That's my guardian angel." Story 27. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, my mother scolded me harshly for something I had done and sent me to my room. Crying with frustration, I stomped into my room, overwhelmed by anger. The emotion was so intense that I had to scream something, anything. I yelled, "I want my mummy." The moment I said it, everything went still inside me. The anger disappeared, the tears stopped, and I was left confused. Why would I cry for my mother when she had just yelled at me and sent me away? Even as a child, it didn't make sense. It was the first time I remember analyzing my own emotions, and the memory has never faded. When I was 17, I discovered by accident that the woman I called mother was not my mother at all. She was my father's ex-girlfriend. He had kidnapped me from my real family when I was 3 years old and abandoned me with her before running off with another woman. The woman who raised me had never told me the truth and had made me believe everything was normal. Looking back, I realized that moment as a child was my first sense that something in my life was deeply wrong. It might not sound terrifying now, but to a child's mind, it was both disturbing and inexplicable. And it changed how I see myself forever. I've been self-analytical ever since, maybe too much so. Story 28. When I was a kid, I went tent camping with my family, and we kept hearing strange noises coming from the woods. My dad went to check and came back saying he'd found a bunch of empty bottles and a torn-up sleeping bag out there. Later, while everyone was distracted, I decided to go see for myself. As I walked toward the spot, I heard weird grunting noises. Scared but curious, I followed them until I found what my dad had described, a filthy campsite with bottles and a shredded sleeping bag. Nothing else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. For the next couple of days, I had nightmares about bears and monsters stalking our tent. On our last night camping, I had a vivid dream that a bear had crawled into my tent and was biting my feet. It felt so real that I woke up in terror, and the feeling didn't stop. My feet were wet, and when I grabbed my flashlight, I froze. In the beam of light was a filthy elderly man sucking on my toes. I screamed, and he bolted out of the tent into the woods. I never told anyone until now. Story 29. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was dating this wild red-headed girl who loved doing reckless things, one of which was driving to old cemeteries late at night. On clear nights with a bright moon, they really did have a strange beauty to them. One night around 1 or 2 in the morning, we went to Pointer Cemetery, way up north in Kentucky. It was one of those perfect nights, still, quiet, the sky crystal clear. The cemetery road curved into a loop that circled back on itself. We drove in, parked on a small incline, and reclined our seats to look up at the stars. We were talking quietly when conversation faded, and we just sat there, soaking in the stillness. Then, without warning, a bright orange light flared to life about 40 or 50 feet ahead of us, slightly to the left. It was like a glowing orb, floating about 10 feet off the ground. It hovered there, glowing softly, and the light expanded until it illuminated a wide area of the cemetery in a pale orange hue. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of being unwelcome, like we had intruded on something that didn't want us there. Then the light began to shrink and collapse inward until it vanished completely. The whole thing lasted maybe 6 seconds. My girlfriend saw it too, but she insisted it was white. She said her friend who studied paranormal stuff told her that white light meant something neutral or welcoming, while orange meant something hostile. She said she didn't feel unwelcome, but I definitely did. I started the car and tore out of there as fast as I could. Story 30. When I was almost 2 years old, my mom and I lived with my great-grandmother, Vera. We had a morning routine. I'd wake up first and go wake her up. She'd make me a bowl of cereal, turn on Beekman's World, and go back to sleep. When the clock said 8 o'clock, I was supposed to wake her again. One morning went just like that, except when I went to wake her up at 8, she wouldn't move. I didn't know what death was, had never seen anything scary in my life, but somehow I knew she was gone. I started crying and walked down the hall. My mom was in the bathroom and asked why I was crying. I told her, "Gumma's dead." She rolled her eyes but went to check. A few moments later, I heard her screaming, "Grandma! Grandma!" and sobbing. I've talked to my mom about it several times since, but she still hates bringing it up. The coroner said my great-grandmother had passed around midnight, but I swore she had made me breakfast and turned on the TV that morning. The TV was still on the right channel, and there was cereal in my bowl that I couldn't have reached myself. Story 31. I was walking home one evening on the quiet country road I still live on when I got that awful crawling feeling between my shoulders and up my neck, the kind that tells you someone's watching. I had only ever felt it once before, in a city when I realized I was being followed. So I looked around, trying to figure out why I felt it here, in broad daylight, surrounded by open fields. That's when I noticed a figure across a field too far away to make out details. I assumed it was a farmer checking his crops and kept walking. The field was about 20 acres wide, so it was a long distance away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I looked back and the figure was suddenly 3 times closer, just standing there facing me. I thought maybe it had run, but it would have been impossible to move that fast through waist-high barley. I kept walking, faster this time, trying not to look again. But after a few hundred yards, the feeling got unbearable, so I turned around. The figure was now on the road, about 50 yards behind me, close enough to see that it had arms, legs, a head but no face, no color, no detail, nothing but shadow. In broad daylight, I stared for a second, then took a step back, and another. It didn't move. I shouted something like, "Hey, can I help you?" Oh, but it stayed still. That was enough for me. I turned and ran as fast as I could, even though I was wearing slippery riding boots. When I reached my house, I turned back one last time. It was standing at the top of my driveway watching me. I got inside, slammed the door, locked it, and when I looked out the window, it was gone. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't ever want to find out. Story 32. When I was in 3rd grade, my family lived in an old colonial-style house in Wharton, New Jersey. It had been renovated several times over the years, except for the basement, which was basically a giant dirt tomb. No flooring, no walls, just earth everywhere. My dad and siblings would leave early for work, but my mom stayed home. She was a seamstress. Some mornings, while I waited for the school bus with her, we'd hear a distinct bounce sound coming from the basement, like someone was bouncing a ball. Along with it, there would be a faint giggle and older woman's laugh, soft and distant. It would last only a few minutes, a few bounces and quiet laughter, then silence. It scared me, but my mom, who had experienced strange things growing up in the old country, stayed calm. She told me something I still remember whenever I feel uneasy. If there's a spirit, it's lonely or searching for something. Let it be at peace, acknowledge it, and if it's a good one, it will either go away or show you something before moving on. Years later, I learned that one of the home's previous tenants had been an elderly nanny who loved children and had died of natural causes in that very house. Story 33. 2 nights ago, my husband and I were going through a box of old books we hadn't opened since moving over a year ago. Many of them had belonged to his late grandfather, mostly old religious, philosophical, and historical texts filled with notes and thoughts scribbled in the margins. It felt like an intimate window into a man I'd never met, yet whose ideas often mirrored my own. My husband opened one of the books and pulled out a folded piece of paper from the inside cover. It was a short biography of a man who had led a Bible study his grandfather had attended. My husband immediately recognized the name. It was one of his former college professors. He looked at the book again and realized that the professor had also written it. Even stranger, the man had taught not only at my husband's alma mater on the West Coast, but also at my university in the Midwest and at a small private college in my hometown. We joked about how eerie it was, saying maybe we were part of some secret generational project and had been destined to meet. Laughing, my husband flipped open to the middle of the book. He froze, then handed it to me. At the bottom of the page in his grandfather's handwriting were the words, "There are no coincidences." Story 34. Last year, my elderly mother and my mentally disabled younger brother died in a house fire. I blamed her for it completely. Growing up, I had prevented at least a dozen fires she accidentally started. She smoked while using an oxygen regulator and took sleeping pills for her insomnia. You can imagine how it ended. I was driving from Massachusetts to Florida when I got the call that morning from New Jersey. They didn't make it out. I was numb but furious, convinced it was her carelessness that killed them both. A year later, after moving to Florida, the grief hit me like a storm. I started seeing things, hallucinations so vivid that I constantly had to ground myself in logic to tell reality from imagination. I'm an analytical person, and I clung to that rationality as my defense. One night, my youngest son wouldn't sleep, so I paced the bedroom with him on my shoulder. Everyone else was asleep, and it was close to midnight. The room faced the street, and through the window, I saw a faint orange glow. Standing there in the middle of the road was my mother. Next to her, my little brother lay engulfed in flames, writhing and screaming. "Brother, help me!" I yelled for my wife, handed her the baby, and ran outside, hoping the vision would vanish like the others had when I got close. But it didn't. They were still there. I dropped to my knees and screamed, "Leave me the fuck alone! Go away!" My neighbor rushed out and found me lying in the middle of the street, sobbing uncontrollably. After that night, the hallucinations worsened. I would see shadowy shapes walking through the hallway, brushing past me as if they no longer feared me. I fought them with every ounce of willpower I had. Then one day they stopped. It's been 6 months of silence. Nothing since. But even now, when the nights get quiet and the air feels heavy, I still brace myself, waiting for them to return. Story 35. 6 years ago, my dad had a stroke and passed away 2 days later in the hospital. He was a Buddhist, which makes what happened next even more meaningful. The scans showed massive brain damage, no hope of recovery. If he were taken off life support, he'd die instantly, so we made the heartbreaking decision to let him go peacefully. My mom, sister, girlfriend, and I gathered around his bed to say our last goodbyes. As we cried and spoke our final words, he shed a single tear, despite being completely unresponsive until then. Moments after leaving the room, my girlfriend's behavior changed drastically. Her posture straightened, her expression went blank, and she stopped responding to anything I said. She turned to me and calmly said, "Follow me." Without another word, she led me through the hospital for 15 minutes, through stairwells and unmarked hallways we had never seen, until we reached the maternity ward. She walked up to the glass window, looking into the nursery, placed her hand on the glass and said, "I'm here now. It's okay." I broke down crying while she stood motionless. We stayed there for about half an hour before returning to my family. Everyone noticed she was acting strange and let her lie down. She woke up 2 hours later with no memory of what happened. To this day, she's my wife now. She still remembers nothing. My dad had once told me when he was 48 that he might not make it to 50, but everything would be okay. He died at 49. I still think he somehow let me know he had moved on. Story 36. When I was about 5 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night and saw 2 glowing figures moving slowly down the hallway outside my room. They didn't light up the surroundings. The hallway was still dark, but they glowed in a strange, self-contained way. I could tell they were human-shaped, one taller and broader like a man, and the other smaller like a woman, but they had no visible features. They drifted up and down the hallway in slow, trance-like movements, almost floating instead of walking. I watched, frozen with fear, before diving under my blanket. I stayed there shaking, too scared to move, until I somehow fell asleep. The next morning I told my parents what I saw, but they brushed it off and said I'd probably been dreaming. Even now, decades later, that memory is so vivid that I know I wasn't dreaming. Story 37. About 8 years ago, when my grandmother passed away, something happened that none of us could explain. In the days leading up to her death, she told my aunt that she kept seeing my grandfather, who had died when my dad was a boy, in her dreams. She said he told her that it was time to rest, that her children were all doing well, and she could finally let go. A few days later, she passed away on her way to the hospital. My parents and I were living abroad at the time, and we flew back to Sri Lanka the next day. During the funeral, a huge atlas moth flew into the room and landed on my grandmother's coffin. It stayed there for hours, completely still, even as people crowded around taking photos. Just before we took her to the crematorium, another atlas moth appeared and landed beside the first. After a minute, both lifted off together, circling above the coffin before flying out through the window into the sky. My dad believes the first moth was my grandmother, and the second was my grandfather, coming back to guide her home. My aunt told me my grandfather used to call her Butterfly. Story 38. Back in 2011, I was trying to get clean from a painkiller addiction, so I went to stay with my father in Reno, Nevada. I got a temporary job as a security guard at the annual Reno-Stead Air Races. My first day was calm. I picked up my uniform, walked around with my dad, took photos of the planes, and felt good about getting a fresh start. The next day during the races, I was near the runway, ready to finish my shift, when I heard a ripping sound like fabric being torn by a giant fan. I looked up just in time to see a P-52 Mustang diving straight toward the crowd at over 500 miles per hour. Instinct took over. I shoved a couple in front of me to the ground and covered them as the plane slammed into the spectators ahead. The next thing I knew, there was smoke, screaming, and chaos. The couple from New York thanked me for saving them as I led them to safety. The smell of jet fuel mixed with something far worse, something you never forget. I saw pieces of people, belongings, even hair scattered across the ground. I found an old man wandering around in shock, only to learn his son and wheelchair-bound grandson had died in the crash. I'll never forget the sound of his sobs or the way he hugged me, broken. It's been over a decade, and I still can't hear a propeller without flinching. That day replayed in my head for years. No matter how much time passes, I still look up nervously whenever a small plane flies overhead. Story 39. About 3 years ago, my grandmother was in the hospital, and it was clear she wasn't going to make it. She had lived with us for 15 years, so we were all very close to her. We drove 4 hours to see her before she passed. Because her small-town hospital couldn't give her the care she needed, she was airlifted to a bigger hospital in the city. My mom went with her on the helicopter, leaving my sister in charge of us for the long drive back. At some point on the way, we were parked on the opposite side of the road. I can't remember why, and my sister was getting ready to make a U-turn. She checked her mirrors, and I did the same, noticing a little red car coming down the road. My sister suddenly said, "I'm going to hit this car." I thought she was joking, but right as the car passed, she swerved directly toward it. I swear the car bent around our truck, like it folded in a way that shouldn't be physically possible. The driver must have had unreal reflexes because they didn't honk, stop, or even slow down, just kept driving as if nothing happened. My sister was shaking. She said, "I didn't see it." I told her what she'd said a moment before, but she denied saying it. My brother in the back seat confirmed he heard it too, and when he did, her face went pale, and she started crying uncontrollably. None of us can explain what really happened that day, but thinking about it still gives me chills. Story 40. When I was 18, my stepfather died suddenly of a heart attack in 2006. He had been in my life since I was 6 months old, and even though we constantly clashed, I always saw him as my father. He was strict, intimidating, and I was terrified of disappointing him. After he died, I was overcome with guilt for never telling him I loved him. A few weeks later, I had a vivid dream. In it, I woke up and walked into the living room, and there he was, standing in his usual outfit. Rugby shorts, a button-up shirt, and flip-flops. I remember asking, "What are you doing here? You're dead." He just nodded and said calmly, "I know." I asked again why he was there, and he smiled and said, "I know you love me." Then I woke up. I can't say if it was a dream or something more, but I woke up with a peace I hadn't felt since he died. Maybe it was just my subconscious trying to heal, but I like to think he came to tell me himself. Story 41. A year or two ago, my family and I were on a road trip through Colorado. It was getting dark, and we needed a place to stay before heading back to Texas the next morning. But it was the 4th of July weekend, and every hotel was either full or insanely expensive. Eventually, we decided a cheap motel would have to do. After a long search, we found one with a glowing vacancy sign. As soon as we pulled in, I got the worst gut feeling I've ever had. The place was dark, run down, and completely empty. No cars, no lights, nothing. My mom went inside to ask about a room, and after 10 minutes, she came rushing back and told my stepdad to drive. Once we were safely away, She explained that the owner had given her the creeps. The lobby was filthy, and the man had an unsettling energy. When she asked for a room, he claimed the motel was full, saying he'd forgotten to turn off the sign. That made no sense. It looked deserted. Then when my mom mentioned she had kids, his demeanor changed. He became eager and called a friend, who supposedly ran another motel nearby. She overheard him say, "She has kids," before giving her directions. My mom was freaked out, but my stepdad wanted to check it out just to be sure. The second motel was even worse rundown, dark, surrounded by parked trucks and isolated. My parents decided we weren't staying anywhere near there. We left the city, low on gas, and stopped at a station. My stepdad and siblings went inside while my mom, grandma, and I waited in the car. When they came back, they looked spooked. My stepdad said the bathroom walls were covered with missing children posters, recent ones. While paying for gas, he mentioned the motels to the clerk and another man there. Both immediately told him to stay away. The clerk said there had been a violent assault at one of those motels the year before, and the other man warned that the area wasn't safe, especially for families. We drove out of that city as fast as possible. Out of options and almost out of money, my mom prayed for a miracle. The next hotel she called told her they had 2 rooms left but were expensive. When they ran her information, they said we had enough reward points to bring the cost way down. That night, we stayed safely in that hotel. To this day, my parents still say that was divine intervention and one of the most disturbing travel experiences of our lives. Story 42. At the end of February, I lost one of my closest friends and regular riding buddies in a motorcycle accident. That night, after cleaning up the kitchen and finishing a few chores, I sat down to watch some TV and eventually dozed off. In my dream, my friend was standing in my kitchen. We were laughing, drinking beer together, and he said something like, "We'll finish the rest next week." Then there was a loud bang, and I woke up startled. I looked at the clock, 10 o'clock. I decided to go outside and double-check that the garage was locked. As I stepped outside, I heard a helicopter flying low overhead. When I looked up, I saw it. It was Life Flight, flying slowly across the sky. I got an uneasy feeling, but I didn't think too much of it and went back to bed. The next day, after finishing my chores, I got on my bike for a ride and stopped at the bar where our group usually met. Everyone looked devastated. That's when I learned what had happened. My friend had been killed in a wreck when a car turned in front of their bikes just 3 miles from my house. It had happened around 9:45, and they were airlifted around 10:15. I can't help but wonder if, in that dream, he was stopping by to say goodbye. Story 43. About 20 years ago, when I was around 10, my family moved into an old house in the English countryside. It was enormous ancient stone, echoing halls and enough creaks to keep you up at night. The estate agent said the site had been occupied by some kind of building since the 1300s. It had been a hotel at one point, and the bedrooms upstairs still had brass numbers on the doors and their own individual locks. Some rooms were colder than others for no reason, and even as a kid, I couldn't stand going into them. The cellar was pitch black and so unnervingly cold that even in the daytime, I refused to go near it. The day we moved in, I was sure I saw someone dart out of sight in one of the doorways, but I brushed it off as my imagination. The elderly couple moving out left us a box of old photographs, newspaper clippings, and keepsakes about the house's history. Among them were 2 microfiches, old photo slides of newspaper articles. A few weeks later, my mom and I went to the library to read them. We loaded one onto the machine and began to scroll through an article from about 100 years ago. It described a fire that had broken out at the old hotel, destroying an entire wing before it was put out. The article mentioned the exact date and time of the fire, 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Thursday in July. I looked at my mom just as she went pale. She checked her watch. It was 2 o'clock on a Thursday in July. The same date, the same time, exactly 1 century later. It felt like the house itself wanted us to remember what it had been through.